2 years ago, our festival convened a unique gathering of 4 musicians representing the larger group that created the first Scott Joplin Ragtime Festival in 1974. The panel of four included Max Morath, Dick Zimmerman, Terry Waldo, and I'm humbled to say myself as moderator, but the first 3 in that list were already on the way to being legends. The idea for this panel was devised by Larry Melton and me because we felt it was time to take a look back at our founding just as the festival itself was developing important plans to preserve its historic archives. The conversation centered on those crucial first years of 1974 and 75. So that's some of the background of the first version of this Legends panel. We established that this series is not defined by one particular year, nor does it need to be. The success of the festival is evident in the ever-present mixture of new and returning performers, a cross-section of the international ragtime scene. 1 year ago, our panel included Edward Berlin, the renowned biographer of Scott Joplin, and composer-performer David Thomas Roberts. They represented the sustained attention we give to the historic record of our ragtime heroes and the authentic sounds of early ragtime music. This year's presentation includes someone who conserves an important subgenre of ragtime with reverence for the historical roots. Another bridged the music of the early 1900s pioneers with new music for the next century. The third recreates the evolution of classic ragtime as it naturally transformed into another style. And thus we have our 3 guests. I will introduce them individually. Very not complete bio form, just a few words. And with a little extra treat for you, if you need a little extra treats in your introductions, when I had a few extra minutes, I don't know why, I decided to anagram their names. Anagram is when you take a phrase.
Yeah, what's my name? There's some dirty variations on it.
Yes. An anagram, you twist letters around in a phrase and recreate a new phrase that perhaps in meaning relates to the original name or phrase. So you be the judge. I have a feeling already how this is going to go. Virginia Tichenor. Get the anagram out of the way first. Virginia Tichenor anagrams into I rag thrice in vino.
Oh, that's cool.
There is a relative of hers who was a winemaker and so forth. So
my father's brother. Yeah.
Kind of, sort of, maybe should have made sense.
All right.
Unique in our ragtime folklore is a family connection in folk ragtime lore. Clever, huh? I've done some research on Virginia's activities and found this description of her skills and talents. She has solid accounting, tax compliance, managerial, analytical skills.
Nice.
She can prepare and review federal and state individual, partnership, corporate, and trust tax returns. Virginia has experience with closely held corporations and LLCs, private equity investments, real estate, venture capital, and sales, use tax compliance, and audits. She also plays piano.
Which is a lot more fun.
Yes, Virginia is a successful CPA. But please don't ask her for tax advice this morning. We'll consult with her as a highly regarded interpreter of the music of the Midwest. When I first interviewed her for my show in 1998 here in Sedalia, she was somewhat better known as the daughter of the great Trevor Tichenor. Now she's simply the great Virginia Tichenor.
Well, thank you, David. Thank you very much. Thank you. Happy to be here.
From literally playing on the streets of New Orleans and first visiting this festival in 1991 to recording the complete piano works of Scott Joplin not once but twice, to composing and participating in a reconceptualization of musical art dubbed Terra Verde, to merging his watercolor paintings with music in a unique travelogue presentation, Scott applies his musical sensibilities to an ever-broadening landscape. He is a thoughtful artist who in 1 minute is playing on an upright piano in a distractedly noisy town square, and the next minute on his break is engaging you in an abstract discussion about music's place in the universe. He has used the term Pan-Americana as a geographical reference for some of his music. Scott Kirby reminds us that music is very much like the musicians and their audience, part of a tangible time and place, through which he invites our imagination to follow him. Scott Kirby.
Wow. Wow, that's right.
I'm going to kill that elegant introduction with the anagram of Scott Kirby, but given 7 consonants and 3 vowels, it was kind of a problem.
Bet.
But it does anagram into tricky bots.
It's better than tricky butts.
Yeah.
That sounds like
We've
a
all
rag.
seen plenty of those.
Neville
Title for a
Dickie.
rag.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, just kill this off right away with the anagram for Neville Dickie.
Be very careful here.
Yeah, that's right. Oh, I went through about 50 I couldn't use and then found one I could use. Evil liked nice.
What?
Nice. I like nice. Beautiful. It's beautiful. You got the best one.
Yeah. All 3 together. No. 2 facts you may not have suspected about stride pianist Neville Dickie. He studied classical piano for 4 years, and early in his career, he learned several hundred rags. Up until the time that Neville started appearing in Sedalia, some of the so-called classic ragtime pianists were only marginally aware of the stride style. When Neville played his version of their favorite rags, I observed few looks of shock, but mostly admiration, awe, disbelief, amazement, and best of all, some players setting out to learn how to do that. Neville is on the Legends of Ragtime panel not for being, in the conventional sense, a classic ragtime pianist. He's a legend because he gives countless musicians and audiences the thrill of hearing one of ragtime's direct descendant styles, stride, with the extra treat of the British pronunciation of titles like Fingerbuster. Neville Dickie.
Thank you, and I'm honoured to be a legend.
Translations provided afterwards. All right, so as far as the questions, they're sort of in 2 parts. The first part is I'm going to ask a cluster of questions, and these guests are going to discuss them at will if they wish or not. But we'll sort of be a general discussion on some topics, and then we'll have specific questions for each of them. Panelists, please keep your remarks. These are the ground rules. Keep your remarks on the order of a few minutes. We can't indulge in extended stories, but a few choice anecdotes at appropriate times will not go amiss. At the conclusion, I'll ask you for a closing statement, so you may want to make notes as thoughts occur, or comment on something for which the opportunity didn't arise earlier. That's the antiquated technology of pencil and paper there.
Yes, all right.
Okay, so this is the first question. You all are considering this question. Answer it in whatever direct or indirect, thoughtful terms you like. Keep in mind, these are very general questions. Feel free to go a little bit on a tangent if it occurs to you to do that. And we'll start with Virginia. Before your first trip to Sedalia, what was your knowledge of the town and your expectations as you made plans to visit?
You're talking about like when I came here as a child? Because
Yes.
when I came as a child, we were told my father was here to, they were doing the ragtime composition contest. And at that point, my dad he was a judge, and Sedalia used to host a composition contest, I recall. And anyway, and for us as kids, my brother's 3 years younger, it was a big adventure to come here. You know, we just basically kind of hung out, but we were listening to the music. I remember Terry Waldo being here. I remember the Liberty Center. I remember a lot of really positive, fun times. Anyway.
And this is the thing, you have a unique perspective there.
Yeah, and briefly that trip, I don't think we were here as children for the first one, which was 1974, but we came in 75, and the sort of excitement on that trip was my brother broke both his wrists while he was here. We were, my mother, we were kids. I mean, I was like 8 years old, my brother was 5. We were jumping around, but we were part of it. The one thing I'm so grateful for is my parents exposed us to this music by taking us to everything. My mother took us to all Dad's gigs, Anyway, we were kids romping around at the Liberty Park, and I think she was just probably trying to get us out of there to burn off some energy. And we were on the monkey bars, and I jumped down, and my brother followed me, but he landed really hard on his wrists. And we spent the rest of that festival in the hospital here in Sedalia. Anyway.
Truly an arresting development for your
Right.
brother. Yes. Scott?
I'll get the same question.
Yes.
It's not fair. I had time to think about it.
No, that's good, you do.
When I first came here, I expected everybody to float in on hot air balloons, you know. So it was the holy grail for me to go to a ragtime festival. I was living in a ragtime vacuum, and I didn't know that I had to be because I was in New Orleans and there were ragtime people there. Not a lot, but Tom McDermott was there, and I met John Arpin on the street there. I met Max Marathas, a street entertainer there, when I was pushing my piano around. But I really didn't have any ragtime connections until I met David Thomas Roberts, and he was living in Mississippi. So I didn't know what to expect. I knew it was a small town in the Midwest, and I was from a small town in the Midwest, but I didn't have any idea what the festival would be like and what a strong community it would be of supportive, mutually admiring musicians. That was new to me. The scene on the street in New Orleans is a little more cutthroat, and in the music business in general. But ragtime musicians at this festival when I came in '91 and still are really supportive of each other, really complimentary. Backstage, everywhere else, that's pretty refreshing.
This, in fact, is echoes of the first Legends panel a couple of years ago when I asked virtually the same question and got virtually the same answer in so many words about the community and the family, already an instant family feel to what we're doing and supportive.
One little footnote on that, Trevor Tichenor was one of the first people I met here, right outside this building, and he told me how much he liked my Joplin recording, and I thought, wow, this is coming from somebody who's like really, this is Trevor, so that was a really nice, and he, those of you who remember Trevor know what I'm talking about. His manner was so gentle, but really sincere, so I just wanted to get that.
Neville, preconceptions about Sedalia before you got here? First time?
What was the question?
What were you doing on October 3rd, before your trip to Sedalia, what was your knowledge of the town and your expectations once you would be here?
The first time I came?
Yeah.
Well, I stayed with Trevor and Virginia. Virginia was about this high. I think, when would that be? The 70s?
Yes, yeah, would have been in the 70s.
1970s. So I had the pleasure, because I was doing the Goldenrod showboat, and I stayed at Trevor's house, and then I came to Sedalia, and for me, I was meeting people who I'd just read about. They were sort of legends I was going to say legends in their own mind. No, legends in their own right. I can't honestly remember who I met because I came here in the 70s, I think the first time. Yeah. But I can't honestly remember. There were so many piano players around, and I just did my bit and then went off to New York. But I can't honestly remember much about Sedalia. I remember the after-hours drinking quite well.
We'll follow up with a question about once you got here, impressions and what happened and so forth, but that sets the stage, and that's fine. Okay, second question for everybody, and we'll start with Scott. What were your first impressions on Sedalia and the festival on your arrival? And you began to answer that a little bit, but I'd like a little more.
I did, yeah, sorry I wasn't focused. That's true. The festival upon arrival was a little overwhelming, I guess, geographically. It was so spread out. We did a lot of things in the park and Best Western, but my impression was that everybody had a thirst for fellowship, and not just musical fellowship, but people standing around, in the back rooms talking about, and I think you were there with your tape recorder, like you always were, and doing interviews, and I found that fascinating. And the people were not just interested in performing the music, but in talking about it. And yeah, I found that there was a great enthusiasm. That's when we used to, we were staying up. Some people still do. I'm definitely leaning more towards going to bed early these days. But I remember staying up all night with Dalton Ridenour when he was at his very first festival, when he was maybe 13. We stayed up at the Best Western. We pushed the piano out into the parking lot. It was a year they had a piano in one of the downstairs rooms. We pushed it out into the parking lot. Mimi was there too. And we just played and played and played. I think they finally shut us down about 3. So I love that enthusiasm.
Neville?
Well, my start to Sedalia wasn't a good one because they said, you're staying with a volunteer. So I turned up at Sedalia, and I got to Sedalia. I didn't know who I was staying with. And I got to the house. The door was locked. Nobody was in. I arrived there about 2 o'clock. 3 hours later, I was still standing with my cases, waiting to get in the house. Anyway, it turns out that the guy I was staying with worked during the day, and he didn't get home till about 5:30. So that was a great start. But the other thing was that, of course, I didn't have any transport. The idea was that this guy would take me everywhere, but as he had a day job, I had to walk everywhere. Do you know what? I lost 45 pounds that weekend. I was walking miles. Late at night, 11 o'clock at night, I was tramping back to my digs. And, but apart from that, I quite enjoyed it. So, carry on.
We may get to more upbeat parts a little later in your story, I hope. Virginia?
So I first came here, as I said earlier, as a child, so I'm going to jump forward because my impressions, I think, as the question is heading towards, is to talk about what our impressions are as musicians when we first came here. And so when I basically started, when I was about 15 years old, I decided, hey, I really love this music and I want to play it. And I remember my father bringing me here as a teenager, which was a very different perspective than having been here first as like, a little 8-year-old girl who was just plink, 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 not really into the music yet. But I remember coming here and like my first times actually performing and how excited it was. Like, I echo what Scott said, there was this wonderful family community and enthusiasm, and I felt immediately accepted, and it actually really excited me about wanting to do this music, because there were people here who really seemed to care about it as an audience. And anyway, that for me was very formative in wanting to play this music.
A lot of consistency, except for Neville, in the answers here.
Do you want to hear a bit more of my down points?
We'll get to them. We'll have a special section just for that. On to a next question, beginning with Neville. You'll have the first crack at this. Yeah. Describe a moment other than one you have already described from the festival, perhaps at a concert, seminar, or other scheduled event.
One of the things I remember was that I thought, well, I'm doing the Sedalia Ragtime Festival, and as I was a stride pianist, I thought I must learn some difficult rags to play to try and impress everybody. And I remember sitting down and trying to play the Charleston Rag, which, as you know, is quite tricky to play. The Charleston Rag, written by U.B. Blake, and I spent hours learning this thing. And when I turned up at Sedalia to try and impress everybody with the Charleston Rag, there's a 12-year-old kid playing it. Note perfect. And I thought, God, what have I got among here? And I seem to remember Adam Swanson, wonderful piano player. I think I first heard him when he was about 13. And I thought, he's doing what I've been trying to do for 50 years. And there's some marvelous young. That's the great thing about these festivals. That when I started going to festivals in America, I was one of the youngest. Now I'm probably the oldest. But it's great to see a lot of young kids coming up playing that sort of stuff.
Parenthetically, or a footnote, I'm not quite sure. I was going to mention that I'm really very thankful Neville is here this year. I have discovered in the last few years I am either the oldest or nearly the oldest performer on the list, and Neville has a few years on me here, so I'm I'm still feeling like a kid again, thanks to Neville Dickie. Virginia?
All right. Wow, there's a lot of great moments in my mind as far as, the performing over many years here. And I think probably one of the biggest highlights for me was the fact that we were able, with my late father, to be here as the family, as the Tichenor family. And we did a series of performances. I'm thinking back in time here, it's probably around 2002, goes a ways back now. Just the fact that we were able to do that with my father and to be able to, as a family, be here, which was really special for us. So probably one of my biggest highlights. Yeah.
Well, I mentioned the one about staying up all night with Dalton and Mimi, but obviously as a father, playing here with my girls, first Sarah 4 years ago, and then this year with Leah, who's 15, and that's a highlight for me. I'm also looking forward to the possibility of getting them actually in the same place at the same time, working up a nice little set of ragtime, and the three of us could come and play together. So besides that, it's the duets. It's always the collaborations that I remember enjoying the most. With John Gill from Australia, with Morten Larsen from Norway, with Frank French, duets, and then just the other day with Jeff Barnhart. I love the opportunity to collaborate with other pianists, and improvisation is not my forte, so it's great for me to kind of play the rags kind of straight and let these guys, like John Gill, he was like the Tasmanian devil of piano. He was like all around me. It was great. It was wonderful. So that's what I would say.
That certainly is a very important point about our festival, and I'm sure most festivals of anything, but we really see it here. We have generally one type of music that brings all these people together. The idea of the music is ragtime, but we have however many people are here performing it, that many different interpretations and even ideas that are collaborative, as Scott mentioned, and you discover what the other person is doing and you start trying to do that, and these ideas go back and forth and they really carry forward. What ends up from the festival after we're all done is a whole lot more bucket of ideas than everybody individually came in with, and that happens every year. These connecting the dots between the performers is one of the absolute most sparkling parts of this Ragtime Festival. Going on to a new question. Tell us about a special memory from time spent outside the events, perhaps on the street, at a local business, or with the good folks of Sedalia. Virginia.
All right. I have one that came to mind that was a real surprise to me as a teenager performing here. I remember, everybody remembers how before the Maple Leaf Park was built, I guess what's now the Stark Tent was located down there by the train tracks and all the adventures we had playing while the trains would come through. But I remember playing a set down there, and I was like 15, 16 years old, and I got off stage, and a gentleman came up to me, and I assume I don't know where he came from, but he said, "Hey, you're great. I'd like to hire you to play in Disneyland." I was like just flabbergasted, and I'm like a teenager in high school, and I'm thinking, Disneyland, California? Here I end up in California. Anyway, but not at Disneyland. But that always really stuck in my memory. I don't know who he was, where he was, but he gave me his card and said, "You must come to Disneyland."
I know firsthand all of California sometimes seems like Disneyland.
Yeah.
Complete with rolling rides for a few seconds. Scott?
Yes, okay. I have so many memories. I'll just nail one and then leave it alone. I remember trying to go into a bar with the Ophelia Orchestra and trying to keep up. Trying to drink with the Ophelia Orchestra. These Norwegians that just could pound this like really bad beer and they didn't care. I thought Europeans were supposed to have better taste in beer, but they'd just go to these terrible bars and go around.
Like I said, a cultural transition of ideas, yes.
It's a long time ago. Galaxy far.
By the way, the fallacy that Americans think the British drink warm beer is wrong. Or the fallacy is right. Which is that? Americans think we British drink warm beer. And everybody, when you come over to America, you guys drink warm beer, don't you? We don't drink warm beer. We drink cooled beer. I don't know where that came from, but that's just a small point. But talking about John Gill, I used to play in a pub in England, about 10 miles south of London, and it's probably the only time it's ever been done. John Gill was playing in a bar in a pub at one end, and I was playing in the same pub at the other end, about 100 yards apart, but we weren't playing together. He was playing his stuff and I was playing mine.
That's insane.
Yeah. But yeah, John Gill, I knew John from, you know, he based himself on Ron Weatherburn. Did you ever know Ron Weatherburn?
Oh, yes.
Well, John Gill was obsessed. I shouldn't be saying this, but because he's no longer here. But it was a funny thing because there was a piano player called Ron Weatherburn in England, and John became obsessed by him. He started to play every number he played, and when he was at the piano, this is how Ron Weatherburn would say.
That's it. That's where he got it. I didn't know that's where he got it.
Like that. So John Gill started doing that. Then he asked Ron Weatherburn if he could move in with him. Well, Ron already had 6 kids, but he did move in with him for a while, and yeah, I did meet him quite regularly, John. Yeah, he was a good piano player, so yeah, that's that.
I'll throw in an anecdote here that was definitely not on a concert stage. We were in a restaurant, and you know, do us the courtesy sometimes of putting a piano in some of the restaurants and places for if you play a tune or a couple of tunes, they'll serve you some food. It's a nice exchange idea. And a few years ago, a whole bunch of us were having dinner in one of these places, and Carl Sonny Leyland got over to the piano, and he's a boogie player. He doesn't play classic rags. He's a boogie player. He does what he does best. And he got up there and he started making a whole lot of boogie-woogie noise. It was great, actually. But I said to him, I got a waitress over, and I said, tell the guy at the piano that you're very sorry, but they only allow ragtime here. And she's very smooth, very clever, went around, and then she went over to him, stopped him in the middle of a tune, and we could not hear this conversation, but she is saying, and Carl looks up, what? What do you mean? This is what I play. Why can't I just play? It's boogie woogie. What's wrong with that? And he finally catches our attention. You know, we're just cracking up, laughing at him. So he's got it. But it's the only time boogie woogie's been put in its place here at the festival.
Nice.
That was for humor value. Always a good escape clause. Okay, so what do I have here? All right.
I have to ask Carl about that.
All right, now the specific, now for the specific questions, meaning for you individually only, starting with Virginia.
Okay.
We'll have 1 or 2 of these on a round-robin fashion. At what point did you realize you were becoming what might be called a known quantity among ragtime players and composers, and how did the transition materialize, and what steps did you take to give your career direction? And I encourage you to interpret the questions, take whatever
Sure.
parts are interesting to you.
Sure. Well, I remember being about 15, 16 years old, and really had been working hard at learning some of not only my father's material, but had learned, begun to could play Maple Leaf Rag, Dill Pickles Rag, and I remember playing here in Sedalia, and as you talked about the piano being downstairs in the Best Western, I remember it being by the pool, actually, like the after hours, and that's probably why you could wheel it outside, because it was on the lower level, like where the pool is currently. And I think it was that area had been enclosed.
Yeah,
I remember-
it was a Holiday Inn, and it was much more open air.
Right,
Yeah.
and anyway, so I have a really strong memory of playing there at the after hours, again, as a teenager. I remember Bob Darch was there. I remember just a lot of players there, and everybody just seemed really excited about what I was doing, that I had become, I could actually do it. Anyway, and from that point, I remember, because of my dad and his involvement in the St. Louis Ragtime Traditional Jazz Festival, it used to take place on the Goldenrod Showboat that Neville mentioned. That festival usually followed Sedalia. It was usually the very next week, and having been able to do that in Sedalia, it was really exciting to be able to play on the Goldenrod as a teenager and be able to do it. And I think that really was so formative for me, and being able to kind of go, okay, I'm excited about this and I want to do it. So those were my steps.
Scott, how has a balance of music and art evolved in your life? Are there other artistic activities that we don't see but are part of your working day?
Yes, actually, I started painting at 40. I started playing piano at 5. I never expected art to be a source of income. And when it did, it was even more encouragement. But I don't need encouragement to paint. I love to paint. It's my favorite thing to do. And as I get older, I prefer painting to playing the piano. I still enjoy doing my multimedia show a lot. Yeah, I know. So we're supposed to be kind of transparent here, but so that's my moment of candid, disclosure. I still like to play the piano, especially when it's, a nice piano. But I would, if I had my druthers, I think I'd stay home and paint, and not go on the road as much. Other things I'm interested in, I'd like to be a documentary filmmaker. I'd like to interview people in the small towns where I travel about their history and their musicians, their artists, their culture, their main streets. I'm fascinated with that. So that's, if I have another career, that's going to be it. Either that or I become a professional chef. So.
Having spent time in New Orleans maybe contributed
That's more
to
a
that.
dream than anything else.
Thank you. Neville?
Yeah.
Oh, Neville. It's a different question. You're quite right. Describe how the youth of...
Hang on.
Last name first, first name last.
Evil likes nice.
Describe. What was the rest?
No, just describe. No. Describe how the youth of England thought of American ragtime and early jazz. Did the music carry the associations of rural and urban blacks? Were they interested in the composers themselves and the stories about the musicians that we tell? Were they knowledgeable about the history? Was everything they knew from what appeared on album covers? You can take any part of that.
No. As I explained yesterday in my seminar, there's never been much of a ragtime scene in England at all, simply because there haven't been any performers. But I went along for a BBC audition, which I passed in 1968 or 9, and you play 3 numbers on your audition at the BBC. You play for 15 minutes, and a panel decides whether you're any good for the BBC or not. Luckily, I passed, and I played a couple of James P. Johnson things. And a lady came up and said, would you like to do some broadcasts for the BBC? There's a consumer program every morning where they had recipes or they interviewed MPs or politicians, And in between times, they had music. So I used to go up to the BBC, and because my audition was a couple of James B. Johnson numbers, she presumed I was a ragtime pianist. So she said, right, you go up and record 12 numbers, record some ragtime stuff. So I did that. And then I used to go up to the BBC to record about every 6 weeks, and I'd record 12 numbers. Well, you can imagine after a year, I was running out of tunes. And that's when I started learning these obscure ragtime pieces, because I had the Max Morath 100 Classic Rags. That was the only book that was available in England. It was 100 classic rags. And I had a trio, and we used to play 12 numbers, and most of them were rags, but that's when I really started. I had to start learning new numbers because they didn't want to hear the same old stuff. So that's really how I got into learning ragtime. And I became known as a ragtime pianist. Consequently, I didn't get any bookings. Because who's going to hire a ragtime pianist? England is so small that nobody wants to hear ragtime all night. That's why I play a bit of boogie, a bit of this, a bit of that, sometimes a bit of the other. And I like to play. I'm not an expert at anything, but I like to think I can do a bit of this and that. And that's how I survived in England, because Nobody books a ragtime pianist for the whole evening. Nobody books a boogie-woogie pianist for the whole evening. So you got to vary it. Anyway, carry on.
Survival mechanism to be able to play everything, sure. There'll be one more round of a question each. After that, we will have more time for you to decide if you want to tell another anecdote or two, some hysterically funny or sad story you'd like to share with the audience. And I believe we'll have time for some questions from the audience as well toward the end of the program. So, Virginia.
Yes.
Here we are again.
All right.
You are fortunate to have been your father's daughter, so to speak.
Yes.
Though there's no question that you have built your career and credibility on your own merits. What advice or bits of wisdom, if any, did Trevor have for you about the pursuit of your musical career, particularly in regard to establishing your own voice?
It's a good question. He was actually very supportive of me becoming an accountant. I'll never forget. He actually sat my brother and I down. So, many of you know my brother's a trumpet player, and he basically told both of us, he said, it's a lot of fun here to do music, but boy, it might be good if you'd be able to develop something else just in case. I'll never forget all that about him. But anyway, as far as him helping me develop my own voice, he did something really important for me in my development growing up in St. Louis, which is he found me this incredible teacher when I was in high school, a gentleman who was able to teach me how to play ragtime from a classical perspective, a gentleman named Dr. John Phillips. He's deceased now. But he was a college professor at Fontbonne, and my father felt strongly that he could see my interest developing strongly with the music, and he said, you really need to learn how to play the instrument. And he said, anyway, I was so fortunate that he pushed me to work with Dr. Phillips, and I feel like my interactions with him, I think, really helped form me and helped me learn the proper technique, et cetera, fingering and all that on piano. So, and I also say, too, I think my dad did something smart, too, and this might benefit you because you have daughters, which is that he actually wasn't my lead teacher on piano. He always made sure I had an outside teacher, and Dad was always there as inspiration and had a lot of good help and advice. And I'll never forget, as a kid, practicing piano in the living room, and he would sit in that red chair right next to the piano, right across from the piano, and he'd smile, and every once in a while he'd make a comment. But he kind of let me do my own thing, which I think was really important in my own development. So.
Just that one answer, but in fact, most answers for most of these really is instructive to us. I really love the format that we have here for our Legends panel, to be able to, a question that might be in the back of everybody's mind at one time or another about these people, and we have the luxury of time to dig in a little bit. Something you can't do when you're passing by in a street corner on the way to a gig, or, you have to go eat. Scott, in my opinion, composers of any type of music are among the more unappreciated participants on the musical landscape, sometimes ignored even by musicians. I really mean this. Have you experienced this? And if so, how do you make your voice heard beyond the manuscript?
Wow. That's interesting, because I was going to give a little addition to my answer to your previous question, which is that I'm not saying that I'm not interested in as much as music anymore. If I say I prefer painting to playing the piano, that doesn't include composing. I love composing still, and would see that as a much bigger part of my life as I get older. So do I consider that composers are underappreciated? Is that part of the question? Well, I think anybody in the arts is underappreciated in this country right now, period. Composers are among them. So I see the emphasis in this culture as going towards sports and other things, and technology. We're obsessed with technology. So the chapter in my program about John Philip Sousa claiming that American musical literacy is on its deathbed is just kind of tongue-in-cheek, but it's also prophetic, because he was right. And in terms of American musical literacy, it's just gone down since the invention of the phonograph. So composers are included in a larger umbrella. I don't think composers are minimalized so much at events like this, because there is a lot of scholarship, a lot of appreciation for the background of the music, and the historical background on the connections between composers and performers. So I don't feel that so much here, but in general, yes.
That question evolved from many years of doing radio shows, right? Did on-air interviews in classical music and other types of music, plus a long-running ragtime show. But it's been my experience as a musician, surrounded by composers at one time or another, working with composers, helping them write their pieces, or helping them transcribe them for string instruments or whatever. When I sat them down for interviews on the air, it was never failing the impression from most of them that I had the feeling that they were finally glad somebody had wanted to ask them a question about what they do. They are sometimes considered to be those people in the background who supply the music and the performers get the credit, and often some pieces are actually associated more with the performer than they are with the person who actually wrote them. It's much harder to find out who wrote a piece of music than who is playing it. And by, I don't know, I don't want to generalize too much on this, but by their very nature, people who are career composers, I don't mean somebody who wrote a tune in 1974 or wrote a few pieces of music every once in a while. I mean career composers who sit long, lonely hours in rooms with manuscript paper or now in a computer. It takes an immense, thoughtful mental energy to come up with a melody, one of the hardest things in the universe to do, to a successful, good melody, and then develop it into a piece of music. And it takes a lot of trial and error, countless drafts, so you don't even count drafts, it's just rewrite, try something, rewrite, throw it away, start over. And after all of that, they produce a piece of music that they're happy with, and hopefully, and this is now getting to be a long shot, a publisher might be happy to publish. So self-publishing is a big deal, of course. But when I talk to composers, I see just all that inner brain time that they spent in their music over a career, or over a few years of their career, whatever it is, finally getting to express themselves in words, and they sometimes even find it hard to express themselves about what they do because they're not asked all that often. So I was always happiest bringing composers on the air, more than all the other people who have been on the show. I felt like it was a real privilege to have the composers speak for themselves once in a while. Neville, what advice do you have for young Americans who want to pursue a career and life in the music of their own culture?
David, can you talk a bit slower? I can't understand your accent. Are you American or what?
That's odd. It's a New England accent.
Please talk slower.
Old
Thank you.
England accent.
Read slower.
What?
That's much better. There, thank you.
I'll be with you in a minute. What advice do you have for young Americans who want to pursue a career and life in the music of their own culture? In other words, you're an outside observer of the American scene. What advice might you have for our young Americans?
Well, there was a young kid playing last night. I think we all heard After Hours. What was his name? Can you remember? He was 13 years old. I mean, he was sitting down there playing the black and white rag and everything. There's a lot of young, as I've said earlier, a lot of young kids coming up playing. Not enough because in England there's nothing. Kids nowadays, they're just interested, and it's the parents' fault. There's a boom, boom, boom. That's all you hear. And it makes me sad because when you say to a teenager, you mention the word George Gershwin or Cole Porter. Who? Never heard of him. And it's a bit sad, really. But, I think if you're going to play an musical instrument, whether it be in America or wherever, you've got to start early. The Japanese, I believe, are starting their kids learning at 6 months old. I started when I was 7, and I think if you start later than that, you're going to be struggling, because I think 7's the age when you can take things in and remember them. So, all I can say is that if you've got the talent, I must say I had lessons for 4 years, and I hated every minute of it. And my mother used to put an alarm clock on the piano for half an hour every day, and I had to play for half an hour. When the alarm clock went off, I was free. But when I finished my piano lessons, because it was all classical, I didn't enjoy it, but my mother said, right, that's it. You're not learning anything. I'm stopping your lessons. And then that's when I began to enjoy it. Because I could sit down and play what I wanted to play. So I started listening to the pops of the day and picking it up off the piano. And that's when I started enjoying it. But I think, you know, some of the piano teachers get too serious. With kids, you've got to make it enjoyable. When I had lessons, he put this music down in front of me and said, that's what you got to learn the next week. And, you know, now I see some teachers, they have fun doing it, and that's the way it should be, you know. So that's it.
I would like to take some audience questions, maybe a couple, and then we'll revert to maybe another favorite anecdote, if you have any, no pressure, or tell two really quick ones, or you know, something to enlighten us, and maybe lighten us also. But something you said, Neville, reminded me of something that happened with a neighbor of mine when you were talking about the kids and the boom boom and that. At one point, I had a neighbor, father of two twin girls, and he was sort of those really obviously very vociferous, very disciplining kind of fathers who kept a pretty tight rein on these kids. And when they were about 14, I heard him going into a rant about something they had done, and he started getting sort of carried away with that. This is not related to music to begin with, but he was saying, and you're going to be grounded if you do this. You know, it's just not going. We're not going to do that anymore. And by the way, I want to see you kids on the weekend both together here because we're going out for something on Saturday. And your music, no more boom diddy, boom diddy, boom diddy, boom diddy. It's a direct quote. I learned something there. I'm not quite sure what, but after spending some years in music school, I learned something about boom diddy, boom diddy, boom diddy, boom diddy. I will never forget. All right, so the floor, in a manner of speaking, is open. A question as you prefer for one particular person, or perhaps for the group. Maybe someone will respond to it. Who has a question, please? Yes.
I guess this is for Virginia, is it?
Yeah.
Your father was interested in your piano. What did he think when you took up the drums?
He was, I think he was surprised actually with the drums, but always supportive. He always was highly supportive, like for both myself and my brother. But yeah, I think he kind of chuckled a little bit about it. He would have never put drumsticks in my hands as a child, I'll tell you that. It was definitely all about piano. Anyway.
Yes.
Well, I'd like to bring to everyone's attention Danny Mattison's efforts to promote contemporary ragtime composition by financing CDs and everything, but we're not records. And does anyone have, this is long overdue, I think, everyone should congratulate him for this effort. But do the panelists have any comments?
Yeah, on this underwriting of new rags, I
That's
guess.
pretty rare. It's one of those things you just never hear about. I guess that goes back to David's point, which is there's a lot of attention paid to performance, but very, very seldom do you hear any underwriting or funding. By the way, that brings up another question for you. You use the phrase career composer. How many career composers do you know personally? I think I've only met one in my life. That's William Bolcom.
This is beyond the ragtime sphere.
In any sphere.
In any sphere. I have interviewed, I won't bore you with all the details of this, but I had two radio shows together, 30 years doing a ragtime show and 29 years doing what was basically an anything else show, which was live on the air. And I interviewed people who would come through town, so they would include film composers, show composers from New York. You know, I don't hesitate to say they were pretty high profile people who had the grace and generosity to stop by and talk. So in that sense, I mean, yes, these were people who've been making a living composing for one reason or another. Composers of jingles, you know. Now, narrowing it down to ragtime, yes, it would be hard put to find career composers in ragtime, or career anythings in ragtime for that matter. Do we have another question from the audience? Yes.
Yeah.
I've noticed that you're the only woman, I think, here, I mean, in the presentations.
Sure.
And I thought maybe you could comment on it.
Well, I actually noticed that too. And I actually.
Okay, now the next question. Oh, I'm sorry.
No,
Usually the case.
no, I don't think that's often the case. I'm certain it's nothing like any overriding reason about it. I just happened to notice it when I looked at the program booklet myself. I thought, oh, I'm the only girl in the lineup this year. Anyway.
Excuse me, Virginia.
Yeah.
Just to full
It's all right.
disclosure, I am on the
Yeah.
artistic committee
Oh.
who helps choose these people along the way. It's a process. It's not just me. It's not just a few
Right.
people. But she's right. I want to endorse that. There's no intentional
Yeah.
bias that
No.
way, of course.
Yeah. There's not that many of us, actually. That's, yeah. There are some, yeah.
There are some,
Yeah,
in fact,
yeah.
going all the way back to the first years. Molly Kaufman comes to mind,
Yes.
who was, yeah.
Yeah, I'm in touch with Molly.
And a singer from Spokane, Washington, whose name I don't
Ann
remember.
Fennessy.
Ann
Ann
Fennessy,
Fennessy,
yes.
Yeah.
There are quite a few women still active, and they do
Yeah.
stand out. Let me tell you,
Sure.
Sue Keller, Mimi Blay,
Yeah.
I mean, they have a presence, a real presence, and they're usually more here, that's true.
Yeah.
Maybe one of these years we'll have an all-female Scott Joplin Ragtime Festival. Guys will take a break for a year. One more question, and then we'll maybe have some more stories. There are no more questions? How can that possibly be? You know everything you need to know? Speculative thoughts? Commentary? All right, yes?
Yeah.
Okay, you get a second shot.
About composers. Now, this isn't ragtime, it's more country western. Willie Nelson is noticed a lot for his music that he plays, but he wrote a lot of songs early in his career, in particular for Patsy Cline.
Yeah.
And so that's a situation where, did he actually start as a composer and then work into the performing part of it?
That's just crazy.
I don't think that's happened since the 18th century, but I'm not the expert on Willie Nelson, but almost all of those guys started playing and composing both. I mean, I don't know how he would have had the contacts to sell his songs without being a player himself. But yeah, you're right. He's very, very successful at having other people, well, like Hoagie Carmichael was very successful at having other people make his song. Irving Berlin, these guys, they were great composers. And maybe not the virtuoso players. Irving Berlin had that thing in his piano that would, is that true? That go back and forth? Yeah? I don't know. And relating to something David mentioned, my youngest daughter, Leah, who's here, wants to be a film composer. That's her aspiration. So it kind of ties together something you said with what Virginia said, which is that my job as a father is to encourage that. And both of my daughters explored their musical ideas without me pushing them in any direction, which ties together something Neville said too. I didn't ever force them to take lessons or put an alarm clock on the piano. And as a result, they've taken it upon themselves to explore music fanatically and passionately.
Well, you set up a pretty good example.
Well, I'm going to talk too much right now, but go ahead.
No, this is your chance. I am just curious, just artificially gauging this as a random sampling of America sitting in the hall at the moment with an interest in music, particularly interest in ragtime music. Has anyone here, and I mean by any definition of it, attempted to compose a piece, a melody, a fragment of a lyric? I'm not talking about high school poetry, but, in sort of your alternate life, you've just sort of dabbled with music a little bit, even if you can't read or write music, recorded a song on your own? Has anybody tried anything like that? One?
Fred.
Yeah,
Two?
Fred.
Well, yeah, sure.
Yeah, Fred has.
Everybody's raising their hand. Look at that. You're all closet composers. This is good. All right. I encourage that. Sorry? Yes. Fred, actually, I had the honor of arranging one of Fred's pieces a couple of years ago. A real delightful one, as a matter of fact. I arrange pieces for ensembles. People send piano parts. I don't consider myself a composer in that respect. But there is a distinction I want to point out because it's often confused. Composers write original music. Arrangers, adapters, orchestrators take what is there and convert it into something a new group, a new collection of instruments would play, and maybe the reverse too, make a piano piece out of an orchestra piece. So it's a little bit of composing, but it's more rearranging the notes.
Can I just talk about
Yes.
my composing abilities, which are not very renowned, but the only time I've composed a number, I was forced into it. Yes? I was contracted to make 5 LPs. Do you remember LPs? And I'd done 3, and the musical director said, "What are we going to do for the next one?" I'd done one called, the first one was The Robin's Return, which was my big hit, my one-hit wonder. The second one was I Love a Piano. The third one was a tribute to Fats Waller. Then the musical director, he said, what should we do for the 4th LP? So I said, well, Ragtime's very popular. And this was about 1975, the time of the Sting and all that. Yeah, okay, we'll do a Ragtime LP. So I had an orchestra and a rhythm section. Okay, what are you going to do? So I mentioned things. I think we did Pineapple Rag, the Ragtime Dance. And he said, what are we going to call the LP? So he said, what about Rags and Tatters? So I said, well, it's not very original, but, you know, we can do that. He said, do you know a tune called Rags and Tatters? I said, no. He said, well, bloody write one. So I had to sit down and write or compose a tune, and we called the album Rags and Tatters, and that was my first tune I'd written, and it was called Rags and Tatters. And the other one was the final LP I did was called Back to Boogie, and it was a Boogie Woogie album. And the same thing happened. He said, what do you want to do? I said, well, Boogie Woogie's very popular. Okay, we'll do a Boogie Woogie album. What are you going to do? And I mentioned a few tunes. He said, what are we going to call the album? So he said, I think Back to Boogie sounds good. Is there a tune written called Back to Boogie? I said, not that I know of. So he said, bloody write one. So
You didn't learn from the first experience. That was the trick question.
So I wrote a tune called Back to Boogie, and that's what we called the album. That's about my writing ability.
Rags and Tatters sounds like the answer to Rags to Riches story. Actually, you get both sides there. I'll tell you a quick teensy anecdote about, he mentioned, remembering what LPs are. Now, I think we're going back about 15, 16 years when I was doing stuff at KUSF, the radio station. I was also in charge of the record library there, meaning all the LPs, all the CDs, all the 78s, the 45s, and cylinders, which are part of an antique collection there. And I had a high school intern. She happened to be a valedictorian of her class. She's a very bright girl. As an intern helping me out in the record library, on her first day, she shows up. I show her shelves of LPs. And she goes, what are these things? I said, they're LPs. How do you do that? I pulled one out. I showed her, it's a side with grooves, and you take a needle, and, she had never seen a record player. But the thing was, I was looking at this, and I was curious actually what was on the label, and I turned it over, and she said, two-sided. I said, yeah, And we went upstairs, and we're going to work on the 45s. And she said, "Oh, these look like the LPs, but they're smaller. What's going on?" And I said, "Yes, they have one tune. You stack them. The idea is you get your favorite hits, you put them on a record player, and you start it, and it just plays one tune, your favorites, one after another." And she looked at this record. She said, "One tune?" I said, "Yes." And she said, "That sucks." Do we have stories galore? Another one you'd like to tell? Some memory of festival past? Or possibly something you'd like to make up? Anything at this point.
I can say one. I have a great memory of the year, and I apologize, I don't remember the exact year this was, but sometime in the 90s when my father was awarded the Scott Joplin Award. I remember he just glowed, and that really meant the world to him to have been acknowledged by the ragtime community with that.
Yeah, the Scott Joplin Award is unique in our ragtime business, and the only, for a few minutes, became slightly less than unique, if I could possibly put it that way, in poor English, I know, is when somebody actually tried to start a new kind of award called the Raggies. It was a sort of a ragtime disc jockey who thought that, he'd pick out some of his favorite records and just casually give an award and send a letter, and there you go. Congratulations, you've won a Raggie, whatever that is. I think it lasted about 1 or 2 Raggies worth.
Well, I ran a jazz club for 27 years in England. If anybody has any questions about running a jazz club. But we had a lot of fun and games. You can imagine in 27 years, like the time the trumpet player turned up without his trumpet. And you used to get, because I used to have a resident rhythm section, and we'd have different guests every time. And you get guys ringing up the night before, "Sorry, I've got a better job, I can't make it tomorrow." But there was one interesting point, which we booked a modern jazz guitarist, and this guy was an Irishman. And he'd played with Benny Goodman. He'd got awards and everything. And this friend of his rang up. He said, can we have this guitarist at your jazz club? He's good. He's modern jazz." I said, we don't usually have modern jazz. We usually have Dixieland and traditional jazz. So he said, I said, "Okay, we'll have him for one night." So he turns up, this guitarist, and he had his guitar, of course, in his case, and he plonks it down when he arrived at the jazz club a couple of hours before. He said, okay, I'm off for a drink. And he went off for a drink to the local bar, and he came back and he was stumbling all over the place. And to cut a long story short, he sat down and played, and he didn't play one number that anybody knew. He played all original tunes. And he didn't tell anybody what he was playing because he was drunk. So when it came to the interval, I said, "Louis," I said, you got to, make contact with the audience. At least tell them what you're going to play. No, he didn't. He got up and played the second set, did the same thing. So at the end, he could hardly stand. He could still play, but he could hardly stand. So I paid him at the end, and I said, "Thanks, Louis. You got to learn to interact with your crowd." And he turned around and he said, "Do you know what?" He said, "I hate your effing Mickey Mouse music." And I said, "Thanks, Louis, good night."
Yeah.
That was the only time we ever booked a modern jazz musician in 27 years, first and last.
Amusing things happen involving alcohol unintentionally, and not in a severe case. By anybody who knows me knows that, a glass of wine or a glass of beer or something, that's about it for me. I'm a very light drinker. But there was this one night. I don't know how many of you will remember one of the great gentlemen of ragtime history here. He used to come to the festivals and lived in Detroit. His name was Mike Montgomery.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Wonderful guy, one of the neatest people I have ever met. we'd walk into, when I was visiting him, he would take me on his gigs. He loved having me just play, he liked having a violin with him on his stuff, and we could, I would just play whatever he was playing. I was just following along. And we would play schools and nursing homes and bars, whatever it was he happened to line up. We went into it was a convalescent center, and there was this nice little spin-it piano, and the people are already there waiting for us to start playing. They had brought them all in. And Mike, this is kind of a big guy. He just goes to this piano and pulls it apart. He just takes off the top, the entire soundboard cover, some other piece of wood. He says, David, you want to be able to hear the piano. So that's what I do. You got to take it apart or else you won't hear it.
That's right.
But, so where was I? Oh, yeah, so
Yes.
that's not the alcohol part of this, fortunately.
No, that's the sensible part.
But I visited him. He used to play in this place. It's called the Rathskeller, or it was a Rathskeller, and it was a German bar in Detroit. And he said, come on over, we'll just sing along. Meaning, he played piano, lead, sing along, I'd play violin, and have a good time. Fine. So I was playing tunes with him, and then somebody made the mistake of requesting Fiddler on the Roof. Very, as I say, uncharacteristically of me, don't write this down. Don't report this, it'll get all confused. By that time, whatever time that was, because I'll never know, I had actually had a few beers, which for me that's going some. And I decided, okay, Fiddler on the Roof, let's do it. We got a table about this size, put 2 chairs on the table, put another chair on the 2 chairs, and I climbed up with my violin standing on the top chair playing Fiddler on the Roof.
Oh, wow.
It wouldn't occur to me to do that in a million years. Mostly because of the violin, not me, I'm lucky I even remember that. I don't actually remember getting down or falling down or whatever it is I got down, but that's just an amusing little musician's story.
It's too bad we didn't have cell phone cameras back then.
Yeah.
And by the way, the drunk part of the piano story is not taking it apart. It's when you get drunk during the gig and you can't figure out how to put it back together.
That's right, yeah.
Birdcage pianos in England were that way.
Scott, since you have the
I
microphone
have
in hand.
one tiny anecdote.
Okay, sure.
Backstage, we all look out for each other with our various wardrobe malfunctions and whatnot. I remember being backstage with John Arpin, who had a reputation at that time for being the only person to play Scott Joplin's A Breeze from Alabama. And he was about to go on the stage and his fly was down, and I asked him, John, are you trying to catch a breeze from Alabama?
That's great.
And that's absolutely a true story. Told you, we look out for each other.
Well, Scott, I want to continue with you just because I thought of this. You worked and lived in New Orleans, not necessarily in that order, but you were one of those people literally playing on the streets. And I thought perhaps you'd have a memory of something amusing, musical like from playing on the streets in New Orleans.
New Orleans was, it was a buffet of music for me as a 23-year-old. And the challenges and logistical challenges of getting piano on the street was part of the fun. Finding a place to keep it, learning how to repair it. I remember playing with a band, playing with a lot of good musicians, but one day we were playing with a band, we started the piece, and I spilled my coffee into the keys. During the course of the piece, the band kept playing. During the course of the piece, I took the piano apart, lifted up the keys, dried them off, put them back, and finished the piece. That was the life back then. My favorite memory probably of all the times I played in New Orleans was a very quiet thing. A couple of homeless teenage kids that would come by once in a while with their dog, and it was nobody around. It was dark. I was the only person playing music, and they asked me for Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, and I played it for them. And they sat there and listened to it, and it was just one of those really intimate, unexpected moments.
Can I just tell you a quick one about John Gill? And not many people know this, but there used to be a pub in Brixton in England with a revolving stage. It was about this high off the ground. And the band played while this stage revolved. And John Gill was playing with a band, and I was there playing with my trio. Not at the same time, I might add. But this stage, and it was an awful piano. And I got to about 11 o'clock, and the bell rang, no more beer served. And John turned to me and he said, I hate this bloody piano. And he got the piano like that and tipped it off the stage.
Whoa!
Yeah. And hammers and keys were flying everywhere.
Wow.
And the only downside with that was that I didn't work there for at least a month because I didn't have a piano. There it was on the floor, the piano.
John was a fountain of stories. I believe every one of them, but it's just some amazing moments. He was